Hello, good morning, or good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Welcome to the Asia Pacific DNS Forum hosted by Mynic and ICANN. I'm Jarong, the Managing Director of ICANN's Asia Pacific office based in Singapore. I'll be your moderator for today. The inaugural Asia Pacific DNS Forum will be held at the end of the month, and today is our last lead-up webinar. As mentioned previously, in a way, the APAC DNS Forum will be a lead-up event as the international community is slated together in Kuala Lumpur for the ICANN 75th meeting in September this year. Now, for this particular webinar, the topic is on the future of the DNS, and our aim for this webinar is to do a couple of things. The first is to level set and introduce the basics so everyone can join the conversation during the actual event. And the second is to seed key topics which we can discuss more in depth during the actual forum. So we have quite a lot to cover, and we have some very good speakers today. And let's welcome our very first speaker, Jeff Houston. Jeff's the Chief Scientist at APAC, the Regional Internet Registry for the APAC region. Jeff is also an active member of the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, having authored 44 RFCs. For those who don't know him, we've really got the best of the best, not only from our region, but from globally. And every time I sit with Jeff, I learn a lot. So I'm very grateful for Jeff for being able to join us. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you for those very kind words, and hello, everyone. It's good to be here.
So we're relatively familiar with APNIC, being the regional internet registry. And if you're an ISP, you need an IP address, you look for APNIC. Is there something else about APNIC that you can share with us, with our audience who might not know?
Well, APNIC always saw itself as a hub for regional development. And right from when we started, a major part of our effort was actually it started off as training, but engagement, involvement, and helping the region and interested people in the Asia Pacific area to participate in the global forum of the internet. The internet isn't just a thing you use, it's a thing we all share in building. And APNIC has been keen to help folk from this region be a peer member of that engineering team, that building team of constructing more and more of the internet. And so it's not just addresses, but it's also not just addresses in terms of we are keenly interested in the infrastructure of the internet. What makes it all work? And while we don't have a direct engagement in the names area, we are keen observers. And individually, I find myself a very keen observer of the DNS, because like addresses, it's part of the underpinning of what makes the internet the internet.
Cool, thank you. And if you're keen to learn more about APNIC, they also offer a lot of training, as Jeff mentioned. Then you can check out their website, and also they have some initiatives like APNIC Academy, which is quite useful. And if you're interested in learning about routing, the addressing space, you can also be an APNIC fellow. So some very interesting initiatives there. All right, let's dive into today's topic as we have quite a bit to cover. So we're discussing the future of the DNS. And there's really a lot to cover here. But today, what we aim to do is we level set a bit, talk a bit about the basics. Then when we come to the actual forum at the end of the month, we'll dive into some of the topics in a more deeper manner. So when we talk about this topic, the future, right now the hype about the internet is all about the metaverse and Web3. I'm quoting Bitfury CEO Brian Brooks, who explained this quite succinctly in the US Congress when the regulators were thinking, what do they want to do about Web3 or the metaverse? So he described the internet in terms of Web 1, Web 2, Web 3. So Web 1 was the ability to look at content, like what you see on the magazine. So that's quite familiar for all of us. You want to visit a website, you can see all the content there. Then Web 2, the evolution of that was, you can read and write content. And this was like in the late 90s to 2000s when, people started blogging. We have social media, we can post content, but it's very centralized where you rely on a few big platforms to do that, like Facebook, Twitter, etc. Then now we're moving into Web3, where Brooks essentially said that you can own the actual network, a part of the network. When like in Web 1 or Web 2, they are owned by the platform companies. Whereas in Web 3, it comes with like a digital asset, both in the application layer or the protocol layer. So it becomes a new hype where, all these things about cryptocurrency, where you get to be part of a decentralized network. That's really the big hype now. Jeff, do you agree? What are your thoughts about Web3?
I'm trying very hard not to roll my eyes too much. Look, I find these kinds of labels and that classification, at one level, it's just distracting and misleading. Quite frankly, all this hype and the waves of hysteria, aren't really based on a solid foundation. It's all just snake oil and lies. And quite frankly, when it all comes crashing down and we all start looking, how do we all get fooled by this yet again? The real issue is there's nothing beneath it. There's no wisdom in crowds. Crypto isn't magic. And when you start to remove the role of the content moderator, you tend to get an unconstrained environment where the loudest voices are actually the voices of disunity and voices that rip us apart. What was the problem that America had with Facebook? Disunity, ripping them apart. We don't want less moderation, oddly enough. We actually need more. And the cry we're seeing from many national regimes is to insist that these social media platforms have a little bit more in terms of moderation and curation of content, not less. So this whole idea that all of us have our own megaphone and can scream whatever nonsense comes into our head tends to make the loudest screamers get dominance. And that's actually the folk you don't want to listen to. So beyond the fact that, thankfully, I think it's rubbish. I don't think it's going to come to anything. But if it does, it's deeply destructive and we're going to have to stop it. I don't think that's what's driving the DNS. I think that's just snake oil and, fun things to say to Congress when you've got nothing useful to say otherwise. Have I damned it enough yet, or do you want some more?
Well, I think how you described it for me is that fundamentally, a lot of people don't understand that there is a difference between what's happening on the application layer that's being built on top of the underpinnings of the internet, which is our space. So like my wife, she talks about me now, like she'll say, oh, my husband, he works for ICANN. He's a Web 1 dinosaur, and then, chuckles on and on about it. But if we think about our space, the DNS space, like there wouldn't be a Web 2 or Web 3 or Web 4, whatever hype terms you want to call it, without the DNS, right?
Well, the DNS is actually the word we use for a whole bunch of different things. Let me just share a screen for a second, just to illustrate what I'm talking about here. Because when you say the DNS, do you mean that label space, www.icann.org, all these labels that exist? Or maybe you're talking about the name registration framework, because every name is uniquely assigned to somebody. Or are you actually meaning that amazing system that takes one of these DNS labels and translates it into an IP address with blinding speed and incredible precision and incredible uniformity? It just works worldwide all the time. Maybe you're talking about the DNS protocol, or maybe you're talking about the signaling mechanism. But I actually think underneath that, you're talking about something that's fundamental to networking. Because when I think about the DNS, I think about referential systems. You and I can't touch each other. We're doing this virtually. We can't refer to the same thing by sort of, I hand you the object. I'm talking about this. You can have it too. We have to refer to things. And the way we refer to them is this referential framework that we call the DNS. It's words, it's a dictionary. And the internet relies on a common referential framework to make everything work. And you could actually argue that when we started the internet, there were two things that defined it. We all used packets that had their addresses from the same address pool. Now, sure, you could start up your own little network and start numbering things 1, 2, 3, but that wouldn't be the internet that everyone else was on. So if you wanted to be part of that internet, you had to agree to use an address drawn from that pool. Now, interestingly, we ran out of addresses 11 years ago now in the Asia Pacific region. And these days, addresses aren't unique. Addresses are a mess, to put it bluntly. So we're relying on the other thing, because the other thing that defines the internet is actually names. As long as we can all refer to the same thing, communication actually works. And so these days, it's actually the DNS that defines the internet. You can invent your own name system, go for it. But it's your toy, the rest of us can't play because our name system is different. We've all agreed to use this naming system called the DNS. And so the value proposition here is a bit like the value of language. It's not that I can invent a new language, that's irrelevant. It's the people who use it and use it from a common dictionary, an inferred sense of meaning and reference. And that's really basic to whether it's human communication or computer communication. And so the DNS isn't just Web 1, Web 2, Web 3. I'm like, that's, the DNS is so important, so fundamental. It defines the internet. And that's why it's so critical to try and keep it together. So I think we are talking about the very fundamentals of what makes the internet the internet. Everything else, the abstractions that we build above that, is almost superstructure. The solid foundation is actually the namespace. And that's why it's so important.
Thank you. I think in a way I'm relieved, there's all this hype, but the space that we are in remains fundamental and critically important. I think we were chatting before this, and for our audience, I remember one other thing you comforted me a lot is that you mentioned networking. The networking space is fundamentally boring, but that's okay.
Infrastructure doesn't make you a billionaire. There's no billionaires lurking around sort of trying to make a new Facebook out of this. It doesn't work like that. Infrastructure, starts with putting wires in the ground, and it doesn't get much more interesting even at the namespace, because infrastructure is like that. It's the bit that everybody has to use. It's not a competitive bludgeon to try and beat people around the head with. It's the common platform that makes everything else actually work. So I would actually call a lot of my job boring, yes, but everyone else wants it to be boring. The last thing we need out of infrastructure is big surprises. And so things take a long time to bubble up and takes a long time to change. And I would actually argue that's a very, very good thing. Surprises aren't part of what we're meant to do.
Cool. So Jeff, let's set some basics for everyone. I think the earlier slide you showed is really very helpful, because I think in a way, the DNS space, like from the ICANN space, for example, I have spoken to different people, and some of them will be like, oh, it's just, domain names is so narrow. But on the other hand, there's many categories or industries within the whole DNS space. Just another example, like I was promoting this webinar on Twitter, and my tagline was amidst the hype of Web3, where does the DNS fit in? Is it still relevant? And I got a response, 1.1.1.1. So no. But actually, I think that the person didn't get it right, in the sense that public DNS offered by Cloudflare is DNS. It still remains relevant amidst any hype. So perhaps we can talk through a bit about the basics of the DNS industry, you already showed a slide there. Maybe you can cover a little bit more for our audience to see where are all the pieces, where they come together.
Let's talk about this, and I'll again share a couple of slides this time.
Please.
Who's in charge? And surprisingly, nobody. Absolutely nobody. Because when we deregulated telecommunications, and worldwide that happened almost 40 years ago now, we didn't replace the telephone companies with a new orchestrator. We did not. We ripped it all apart, and there's no one in charge. Do what you want. Literally, every actor can do what they want. How do we make a cohesive whole called the DNS? How does all this work? Well, interestingly, it works through markets and market signaling. Because if you do stuff that other people value, good on you. If you do stuff that nobody wants and no one values, it's you that has the problem, not everyone else. And so market signaling actually creates the appearance of a cohesive DNS, when beneath it, there are all these separate markets and market players. It's highly devolved, highly decentralized, very, very loosely coupled. ICANN's engagement is actually a very narrow part of engagement at this kind of top level of the namespace. But there's a market for registrars who act as retailers. It's somewhat different because they can not only sell names at the top level space, but they can sell names at lower levels of the namespace, which are in many ways just simply controlled by contract. There's no other constraint. Who can put in a name? Well, anybody. What about certifying the name for trust? Well, that's again a different market. Who runs resolvers like 1.1.1.1 and Cloudflare? And the answer is, well, you can run your own. Anyone can run one of these. There's nothing stopping you. Whether you choose to do so or not is kind of your decision. But when you do that, you've got to actually make sure that it resolves the same way everyone else resolves, or it's useless. It doesn't work anymore. And so when you look at this, there are a whole bunch of different markets inside the DNS that sort of create a cohesive whole. And so when we talk about the DNS, we're actually talking a little bit about, society, where it's even society without an overarching government. The rules and norms that dominate the DNS are actually areas of market signaling with an underlying underpinning of IETF internet standards. But once you stay within the realm of standards, it's very much open slather. You can do what you want. Your success or failure is actually largely determined by a market. There's no guarantee that you have the right to exist and the right to provide a service. Now, for a lot of us, this is novel. We've never done this before, and it is a brave experiment. And to my mind, this is amazing. We have done what no one thought possible. At the heyday of telephony, and I'm thinking back, 1995, the telephone industry proudly boasted that they had 600 million telephone handsets connected to the global telephone network. And I know you're laughing, because I'm laughing too, because right now we seem to have around 4.5 billion people on the internet. And, it's only going to grow. And if we include in that census all these little devices, we get bored counting when we pass 30 billion, and we're keeping on going. And so in some ways, we have built the impossible. This loosely regulated system that relies on markets and market signaling, and the DNS is intrinsically at the center of this, has scaled beyond anyone's wildest imagining, yet it still works. It works amazingly well. And we didn't build it to do this, it just did it. Why? Because it's loosely federated. And when there's a problem, folk are able to fix their part of it. The end result is a cohesive whole. And so in some ways, this is Adam Smith, that well-known economist, macroeconomist a couple of centuries ago. This is the dream. This is this whole invisible hand of coordination across providers and consumers, creating, a consistent whole. And it's done so for nigh on 40 years without any heavy hand of regulation inside those various industries. As I said, ICANN's engagement is really engagement at the top level. It's not engagement throughout the system. So in that respect, it's almost a modern day miracle. That doesn't mean that everything's successful, though.
Yeah, I remember you mentioned, when we were chatting before this as well, there were a few times people tried to mess with the DNS, and it didn't end very well. Maybe you can share one example.
Sometimes they've tried to mess with it and it's ended badly. Other times we've tried to make it better and it hasn't worked. You could argue that DNS and trust has been a complete market failure. We know how to do it. It's called DNSSEC. We know how to sign domain names, and we know how to validate that so that when you get an answer from the DNS, it's real. Yet, 3/4 of the internet's users don't check the answers they get. They just trust it. And even less, about 95% of the DNS names out there aren't signed anyway. And so trust is actually a market failure. You look at also this open resolver business like Cloudflare. How much money do they make by operating this? Nothing. Because oddly enough, you and I don't pay for the DNS. We don't pay for our queries. We expect queries to be answered for free. But it's weirder than that, because if I publish my domain name and you query for it, as the name publisher, I don't pay for that. I don't pay to provide answers either. So in some ways, looking inside the DNS to find where the money goes round is actually a remarkably frustrating exercise. And it almost beggars belief that it even works, because nobody pays. The folk who shoulder the most of this effort are actually your ISP and my ISP, who run the DNS resolver as part of the, my dues that I pay them every month to have internet access. They're the only folk who are kind of propping up the DNS. And for them, it's not revenue, it's cost. So they don't have a big incentive to make it better. They just have an incentive to make it work adequately well, because you don't change your ISP just because someone else's internet service has a better DNS. In fact, you don't even know the quality of the DNS. It's completely invisible. So in some ways, the DNS kind of sits there as a complete economic failure, yet still functions. And this, again, is one of these modern miracles, that the fact that it works is truly awesome. And it's almost like anti-gravity. I'm like, it's great.
I think the point you made earlier on like DNS and trust it being a market failure, I think I would define it more as to try to artificially add on more trust is market failure. But inherently, the trust already exists. So in a way, how you talk about having DNSSEC, it's not moving very well because the trust on the DNS already inherently exists to the point where it's already working.
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. The DNS is an open protocol, unencrypted. And various folk make it their business to interfere with either the question or the answer. A lot of governments insist that internet service providers within their national regime actively block the resolution of certain names. Other folk with a more malicious intent try to misdirect you by doctoring the answers. And so there's an entire subculture. Some would call it legitimate, and it's certainly in terms of national requirements, that's sovereign rights, but there's another sort of almost criminal and malicious industry going around actively subverting it. You should not trust the DNS. What's the word I'm searching for? Is a wonderful English word called credulity, which is kind of like naively trustful. You shouldn't trust that. That's a bad thing because you're going to get led astray, and people do. And part of the issue is users would like to trust the DNS. So users want it. As a publisher of a name, I would like to provide the right answer every time. So producers want it. So consumers and producers both want a better DNS, yet the DNS itself is incapable of providing it. That's what I would call a market failure. Somehow, when this sort of attribute is desired by everybody, we find it impossible to actually build it. And that's both frustrating, I think, and also kind of demonstrating that the DNS is more complex than you think, when sometimes what appears to be simple turns out to be astonishingly hard to actually do.
That's helpful, Jeff. And we'll dive deeper in during the actual forum on this particular area. But I think that's a good segue, because we think of how to make it better, how to sometimes change it. So there is an expectation to make DNS bigger, faster, better, although the market is difficult to make it move just like that. So,
I
broadly,
think there are big moves happening. This industry is trying to produce three things at once. We're trying to get more and more devices onto the internet, and our scaling factors is now not twice as big or 10 times as big. We try to scale this by a factor of 1 million or so, 1 million times bigger. This is massive when you think of the amount of silicon out there. We want it to be faster, really fast, right? And we want it trustworthy. So bigger, faster, better. Now, for the DNS, the issue comes, how do I get you good answers quickly? And part of the evolution now is to actually make the DNS more subtle. Rather than just asking the DNS, I want to go to google.com, tell me an IP address. You actually say to the DNS, I would like to connect to the web server at www.apnic.net. And you actually say that to the DNS, a service request. And the DNS will come back saying, I think you want to use the quick protocol. I think you want to use this encryption. You might want to use this key for your server name indication. Here's all of the mechanisms, not just the IP address, that let you perform a rendezvous. Why do I do that? Why do I add all this extra information to the DNS? So that you can start sending data one round trip time later. So instead of toing and froing, how should I do this? What sort of encryption should I use? What's the weather? What's the time of day? Where are we? All that kind of stuff, which takes an age. Inside one transaction, query response. My next packet is to that service, the service that I wanted to go to anyway, using a profile that matches the service characteristics of where I want to go. So what we're seeing in the DNS is actually making it richer and actually putting more in the query, what I intend to do, so that we can get more in the answer. Now, at the same time, because that's sensitive information, because I'm telling the world what I'm about to do in the next millisecond, whoops. And maybe I shouldn't get too many people looking over my shoulder at that point, because if they can jump in fast, I'm in deep, deep trouble. So the other part of this work goes under the general umbrella of DNS privacy. How can I make sure that that conversation about intent is not broadcast to the world at large? I could be on Wi-Fi. You could be listening. How can I stop that? And the other part of this is actually to improve the privacy aspects of the DNS, to make sure those really sensitive conversations about intent actually have some integrity and aren't just telling everyone, hey, hack me here. I'm right here. I'm about to do this. Send packets this way, which would be a bad thing.
Well, Jeff, you already covered some pretty good directions of where the DNS is heading in the future. Again, when we talked previously, you also made a point about, on the one hand, this is the direction we're all moving, but on the other hand, the DNS is kind of being dragged down by its past. Can you explain a bit about that?
The problem that we've got is that in trying to change the DNS and to add more features, there's an awful lot of things out there that speak the DNS. And you think, it's just a few resolvers and a few authoritative servers and so on. But no, it's my modem that connects my house to the internet that has a DNS server in it. The DNS actually is implemented in every kind of place, you could possibly imagine. Now, let's say that I'm, Facebook or Akamai or Cloudflare, and I want to change the DNS. I want to add behaviors. Well, the list of people that have to actually make the change doesn't just include some DNS resolvers. It includes platforms like Apple's iOS and Android. It includes all those CPE and so on. And the sheer time scale and cost of forklifting upgrades in the existing internet infrastructure says we can't do that anymore. And so we won't. The folk who want change really have to drive it themselves. And the folk who want change these days are actually applications. And increasingly with things like DNS over HTTPS, which drives the DNS away from the platform up into, well, we'd call it the browser, but it's really just the application, says I'm actually able to tunnel through the existing sort of bits of DNS and not touch them. I drive through in an encrypted tunnel and I actually make the namespace work for me because I talk to my resolver independently of everyone else. Interestingly, the folk who have the money, in this case, it's the application world, the folk who have the motivation to make the DNS sing and dance faster aren't going to wait for everyone else. They're just going to take their bit of the DNS and make it work faster for them. And whether your name's Akamai or Cloudflare or Alphabet or whatever, you're going to do this because we're driven for a faster, bigger internet. And basically forklifting and upgrading every part of the infrastructure is just too difficult these days. So the end result now is actually a change where we stand the risk of losing that essential cohesion of one internet. And we're actually going to make little splinter bits of DNS net as applications start going their own way. And I think the challenge over the next, I'll go 10 years, the challenge is to push forward the agenda that says, if we lose coherency, we lose the internet. By all means, make your bit faster, but don't make it different. Don't hive it off into places where when I'm using Facebook, I'm in an entirely different space than when I'm using LinkedIn and so on and so forth. If we can convince folk that there is still value in a common unity of a namespace and a network, we're doing okay. But the risk from these application folk to corral users and to actually guide them into their environment and not let them escape is always going to be a risk here. And trying to get market signals, because there's no such thing as regulation, market signals to insist that even in these novel forms of DNS use, there's still value in a coherent single name system is actually going to be a big part of what we're going to talk about over the coming years. And I think it's a valid conversation.
Yeah, that's very interesting. There's still quite a few questions I prepared, but already we've covered quite a lot and we're getting some questions. So let's save some time for the questions.
Sure.
So we got Cheryl Dengnan who raised her hand. Other participants, if you want to ask a question on the mic, you can raise your hand as well. Then we'll take that. Otherwise, you can type your question in the Q&A pod. So we have both for now. So we'll take the questions. And in the meantime, if you're joining us also on YouTube, you can also type your question in the comments. We're reading those as well, and we'll post it over here for Jeff to see. So please feel free to ask any questions. So we'll go to Cheryl first. Cheryl, please. Go ahead to unmute, Cheryl. Nope, not possible. All right, let's do the written question first from Chi Yingren. Currently, we have decentralized DNS or blockchain DNS. So does it affect the whole internet or ICANN? What should the markets and what should we do?
There is no wisdom in crowds, and replacing one form of ledger keeping with a different form of ledger keeping, i.e. blockchain, doesn't actually make anything change. The thing to worry about blockchain is you have to put barriers to stop replication and subversion. And so we end up with, say, Bitcoin, where a sizable percentage of the world's energy output is being spent solving mindless cryptographic puzzles just to make a different bunch of ledger keepers rich. This is crazy. It's incredibly inefficient. If you're at all worried about carbon dioxide output, solving Bitcoin crypto puzzles is about the craziest thing we humanized apes could ever have imagined doing. Madness. You know, replacing one bunch of ledger keepers with another, automating it, doesn't give you progress. It simply creates a different form of overlord. And it's actually one that actually doesn't have any form of latitude. And oddly enough, because of the way it works with its consensus protocols, can be subverted in ways that we cannot repair, cannot. And that irrevocability inside that structure is absolutely dead set scary. No, I don't own any Bitcoin. No, I never intend to. I'm not a betting person. And that's all it is. I don't think we should be playing that game in something as important as the DNS. Play it with money. Who cares? It's only money. But once you start mucking with the DNS, you know, you're playing inside close to me, and I object. Don't go there. Don't do it. It's a really bad idea. There, if I said it. My opinion.
Yep. Cheryl, are you able to unmute yourself? No. Any other questions from the audience? Feel free to raise your hand and you can ask a question, or you just type in the chat. Nope. Okay, before we go to Ajay, our next speaker, I think just writing on what you mentioned, Jeff, I think on like decentralized or blockchain, the idea of removing intermediaries, do you think that it's entirely possible to do that completely?
But the thing is, it doesn't remove the intermediary, because the issue of the DNS, and indeed it's an issue common with IP addresses when they used to have any meaning years ago, is uniqueness is the issue. Uniqueness. It's my name, not yours. And the only way we understand how to implement uniqueness is to actually run a ledger where we write down the name and we write down some association with the holder. And whether it's a public key or your name doesn't really matter. It's just a ledger. Now, what Bitcoin, in fact, sorry, what blockchain and similar try and do is to make these ledgers automated. That's easy. Anyone can do that. But then make them automatic. And that's a lot harder. And trying to make them run as a distributed computation that's automatic involves this issue of, I'm going to resort to crypto, I'm going to resort to difficult crypto problems, I'm going to create exclusivity such that not everyone can actually write the ledger itself, only folk who are willing to do a lot of CPU work. And really, all you've done is replaced one bunch of folk who happen to have a contract with someone, ICANN or whoever, with another bunch of folk who happen to have a room full of spare computers and a huge power bill that they're willing to pay for. You know, in some respects, which is better? Well, I would actually go for the contractual world, the world where there are true obligations. I'm not a big fan of trying to negotiate with an algorithm when mistakes happen. I really can't see there's any latitude there for the way humans operate. And to my mind, this is a harsh, unforgiving, mindless, and senseless world, promoted only by folk who want to make a quick buck tomorrow and then run away to a world where humans still exist, leaving the rest of us to deal with the aftermath. This is horrible. Don't do this.
Well, great points, Jeff, and very thought-provoking points, which I think is exactly our intention, to seed some of these points and we can discuss further. We're going to be tight on time and we have a few more questions coming in. Let's hold on to them. We may be able to answer them towards the end of the webinar, but I'll have to move on to Ajay for a bit. And thank you so much, Jeff.
Thank you.
But stay on, we'll have some come back together for some more discussion at the end. Now let's go to our next speaker, Ajay Datta. The topic of a multilingual internet is very close to our region's hearts. And when we think about the future, we also think about a future where even if I cannot speak or type English, I can come online. So let me introduce Ajay. He's been on our forums webinars before. He wears many hats, chiefly as a businessman and technopreneur. He is well known in the ICANN community, being deeply involved in our work in internationalized domain names. And he's also the chair of our Universal Acceptance Steering Group. Jessica, can I trouble you to spotlight Ajay instead, please? Then also, still on Ajay, a couple of weeks ago, we were on a call together with the Bangladesh Minister of Post and Telecommunications. At the call, Ajay shared some great advice for the Bangladesh community to plan a strategy towards universal acceptance of internationalized domain names. And we'll be hearing more from the Bangladesh community soon. But the point I'm making is it really speaks to the high regard the regional and international community has for Ajay on this topic. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us, Ajay.
Thank you for your kind words here, Jerong, and thank you for the opportunity for me to serve as a volunteer here. Thank you.
Thank you. Now let's come to today's topic. We'll switch angles a little bit from where we left off with Jeff, but dive into something we've been pushing, which is on internationalized domain names. We've covered this topic before, but if this is the first time you're joining us from the audience, internationalized domain names, or IDNs, are basically domain names in local scripts. So you don't use the typical English alphabet as the base. So you can type a domain name, web URL entirely in your own script. Now, let's just first ask Ajay, what's your vision? When we talk about the future of a multilingual internet, what's your vision of a multilingual internet in the future?
Jerong, let's say you're asking me to paint a picture for the future of internet almost here. And let us go back 30 years back when somebody was thinking about top level domain names. Somebody was thinking about how to get the names per se, and somebody was thinking about the DNS. And those were the times. Let us not forget, there was no mobile phone, there was no Wi-Fi, there was no lease lines, there was no data, and still some infrastructure was getting built. And we are almost at the same tipping point for the language-based internet. Because in the last 30 years, internet got evolved mostly in English language. All protocols, and you start from anywhere, all RFCs, all protocols, all programming languages, DNS per se, everything believes in ASCII character set. Now we are talking about the language for people who do not speak or write or read English as a primary language. Can they also contribute, and can they also participate as good as you and me can? And that's where the new internet is getting evolved, where people, which is more than 75% of the world, which is very large number, who can trust the access, who can trust the names, who can trust what they see if it is in their own language. And that's where the language importance comes into a very big play. So my prediction about the future of internet is that the internet size, whatever it is today, it is going to be at least 3 to 4 times size in less than a decade in a regional language internet that will have IDNs, EAIs, and the content.
Thank you. So just playing a bit of a devil's advocate here in a way, the internet is already multilingual because content is available in all sorts of languages. But must it be on the DNS? Must there be internationalized domain names for us to realize this vision?
So I think to start with, right now, IDNs and EAIs plays an important role. So let's imagine this event, MyNIC and ICANN hosting APAC DNS forum, and we have a website, APAC DNS forum, right? And that's an ASCII domain name. Please imagine, how does a Chinese linguist will access the domain name if he do not know English? How will he type in? He cannot. The content may be still in Chinese there, but the access is blocked for him. He cannot type the domain name per se. And that's where the key starts. So we have to break that barrier and take that barrier away so that he can come online with his choicest language to access any content. Content probably comes next, but in the word, context has come before, which is okay because English people also like to read the content in their own language, which is also serving the purpose. That's perfectly fine. But we need to also worry about the people who do not understand English and give them access to the domain names and email addresses per se. And that's where it is very, very important. So to me, domain name in a language of person's choice becomes a very fundamental for allowing him to access content in his own language. It's a very important thing. DNS is behind the scenes almost. And as Geoff, when Geoff speaks about DNS, you don't need anybody else to speak on DNS. He has covered almost everything there. And he speaks so quietly and so simply that even a non-tech person can almost understand it. So this is very important that once Geoff has said the context well, it's a huge thing which is underlying the browser, underline every operating system, underline every IoT device, every application. So it is almost underlined for the end user perspective. So you, me, Geoff, and the people like us will understand what's going on in the back. But as a end user, people need not to really worry about end user. So it's like when you travel in a bus or a car, you really don't worry about the road, right? You are worried about your comfort in a car. And the DNS is providing you that road, the direction, that map, where you want to reach. And that may not be the perfect example for DNS, but just for a layman perspective, this is kind of understanding. You don't really need to worry about that road at all. Road is perfect. It is being controlled well by ICANN, by other entities involved. And you just enjoy the ride to access your websites and content by traveling in your car and a vehicle, whatever you like.
Thank you. Coming back to IDNs, actually within our region, there's quite a lot of effort to push for IDNs. So IDNs are available for registration already. If like there's many of the country code top level domains, they offer IDNs like .thai. For India, there's .bharat. For Bangladesh, there's .bangla. There's domain names in Chinese scripts as well. But the progress is very slow. And why do you think this is the case?
So I guess we have not done enough. I always say that when the results are not good. So my elders, I have been hearing, when you have a tea and you say it is not enough sweet, you just add more sweet to it and become sweeter. And this is like the hard work. The amount of effort which is being done definitely has scaled up. But is it enough? Answer is no. So that's where we need to probably do more effort here. And of course, the evolution take time. It doesn't happen overnight. It's an evolvement. The person who has never accessed internet before, we are trying to get him online. So we have to think more larger, not just the domain name, the website which he will need the first time he accesses internet, the content which he will need first time. So imagine that once the internet gets evolved, was getting built and 20 years before, this was largely more chat and email, nothing more. ICQs of the word, Hotmail of the word was the everybody's thing. Slowly the content came into play because people get bored. So how much you will chat, how much you will do dating, how much you kick the fake profiles. And this internet got evolved. Everybody, all of us have gone through that phase. The similar kind of phase may not be the exact one is required for the new class of people who are going to access internet. So we need to really worry. This class has evolved. This class is looking for more valuable time on internet, very specific content, very specific solution. But this is not true for the class which has never accessed internet. We need to let them see the power of internet and serve them what they really need today. So for example, a farmer If you need to bring a farmer who has never understood English, who has never traveled to a bigger city, stays in a very small town in a country, whether it is China, Singapore, or India, it doesn't matter. He will have some problem to be solved. And that problem requires to be solved for large number in rural areas, in a smaller cities, in smaller villages. And we need to pick up those solutions. So I think there is an opportunity to create another Facebook, another Amazon, another payment gateway, another thing for that class of people, though who are not looking for very sophisticated services, who are looking to solve their daily problems. And daily problem for you could be to bring food at the 10 minutes order, but for him, food is not the problem. For him, cinema hall is not there. For him, flight ticket is not important. For him, there is something else which is important. And we need to address that. That is a very important thing. And on the IDN. And I think that's where the Ideans will progress. Government of India did a fundamental, very good job to promote them right now. But I think as the conversation progresses, if we get time, I will share that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think my takeaway from what you just shared is if we want to realize a truly fully multilingual internet, it has to happen across all the different layers and the different stakeholders as well. But we're a bit pressed for time. So I'm going to see that as one thought, because we want to discuss how we're going to get there during the actual forum. But let's take the last 10 minutes to all come together and we can answer any questions that the audience might have. Let's all come together. And again, from the audience, if you want to ask a question on the mic, feel free to raise your hand. And otherwise, you can type it in the Q&A chat pod. Don't type it in the normal chat because the speakers might not be able to answer them. So I'm seeing one interesting question that popped up, and Jeff has typed the answer. But while we're waiting for more questions, maybe Jeff, you can talk a bit about the question on what are the implications for DOH and DOT for DNS over HTTPS and DNS over TLS. Maybe Jeff, you can give a couple of minutes and just share the answer with everyone.
Thank you. Yes, this was just trying to emphasize this whole issue of when you're madly successful and everyone does it, how do you make changes? Now, if there are only 3 DNS resolvers on the planet, you could change 10 times a day and, that's fine. You only need to change 3 instances. But if you think of where the DNS as a piece of code is buried, it's billions of places. We're never going to change it. And so let's say that I want something else. I want a change of behavior. I'm trying to make it faster. I'm trying to make it more secure. I'm trying to do something with the DNS that I think is worth doing. The problem is that I can't change those billions of devices. I can't force everyone to buy a new piece of CPE. It isn't going to happen. And so the other way of doing this is to actually use encryption for a way that it wasn't necessarily intended, to actually directly tunnel through all of this infrastructure. No one can see what I'm doing because I'm encrypted. And I can move through that and innovate between my application and its corresponding server somewhere out there in cloudland. And so DOH and DOT is not necessarily about securing the DNS channels and reproducing the same mechanisms and structure of resolution. The real opportunity is we've unleashed a new wave of innovation that allows applications to drive at their own speed as long as they're willing to build just the little bits of infrastructure they need and ignore everything else. Pluses and minuses. Malware can do it just as easily as, serviceware. And it does make all people's job easier, including the bad people. But nevertheless, this is, I think, an irresistible move, and that we're going to embrace this if we haven't already wholeheartedly. It's a big change for the DNS to recognize we're so big, we can't change. And so we have to think differently about the way we innovate. And that's why DOH and DOT is so important.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any new questions. Maybe Jeff, you can also talk about the other question on Will the virtual world use DNS?
Well, I think I said right at the front, you haven't got a network unless you all use a similar referential system. Otherwise, you've got lots of little systems that can't talk. So if you're talking virtual world, you're kind of assuming there's only one. And as soon as you think there's only one, you've then got to say, well, what glues it all together? What's the defining state that makes it one world and not 7 billion of them? And the answer really is a common referential symbol system. What's a common referential symbol system? A name system. What's our shorthand for a name system? Oh, it's the DNS. So I think even in the words, a virtual world, you're kind of assuming, although you didn't maybe think of it, but you are assuming a DNS, because otherwise you just got chaos.
Thank you. All right, I see one more question which we have time for. I think this one is for Ajay from Vivek Goyal. DNS abuse is a real problem and people who are new to the internet would be more vulnerable. Does Ideans have an inbuilt mechanism to prevent abuse because just the nature of the language makes it much more easier to create similar looking domains using non-Latin characters?
No, I think it does not change anything on DNS. Underlying, it's a Unicode which gets configured into DNS even for IDN. So those who would like to abuse this will not be a very difficult thing from the DNS perspective. From the domain name perspective, abuse and attacks which could come because of the language, I think those limitations related to the knowing the language and the domain name could hamper for a little bit, but not for long. So this is not going to be very different. But let me tell you one different thing. When the internet got evolved, the security measurements were less when the ASCII domain names were being built. But I can design a very wonderful system for top level domain names on Ideans that was label generation rules. And these rules created some kind of inbuilt security in the naming system itself that may not translate to the DNS per se, but for example, similarity, for example, mixing of languages, all those things were taken care from the name perspective per se. So the abuse is likely to be less on Ideans from the name perspective. From the DNS resolving perspective, it may not change much there. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful. I think there will be a few more discussions on, tied to IDNs will be things like security, also would be things like the question of fragmentation as well, which is, if I'm only using my own language and you're using yours, then will we be connected? Will we be able to communicate? But I think we are quite tight for time now, so I think we need to wrap up. I'm very grateful for all the questions coming in and the interactivity, and also very grateful to our speakers, Jeff, Ajay, thank you for taking the time. And I think we've seeded some good questions, which we will have a particular session during the APAC DNS forum to discuss. Just to wrap up, some key takeaways. The DNS, you should really see it as infrastructure, and even with the hype, it's okay. It's okay for infrastructure to be boring. I think it needs to be boring so that it's here today and it's here tomorrow. I think Jeff shared a very good point that DNS is like the common language we have all agreed to use, and it holds everything together, without which there wouldn't be Web 2, Web 3, or Web 4. Even if we go virtually, if there's no networking, we can't be connected to one another. I think again that's a big takeaway. In terms of the future, we're all going for bigger, faster, better. Looks like the DNS has evolved itself over the past many years. Looks like we're going to be able to continue to go there. But I think what's important also in our space is we let people know that how important this space is. And even though we might not be billionaires, but I think the work we do has significant meaning for people who are using the internet for their livelihoods on the one hand, but also for access to information, for making life better. And the next question is, how do we get there? What kind of challenges would there be? Already there were a number of areas that Jeff has described. Some at the application layer, people want to move faster, then they will find ways to tunnel through without having to wait for everybody. But then that would be the question again of possible fragmentation. That's something which we can discuss again during the actual forum. So I'm going to wrap things up here. Please join me again to thank our speakers, Jeff, Ajay. Thank you so much for the time. Very thought-provoking session today we had. And before we close, I would like to invite everyone to stay after the webinar to take our survey. You can click on the link. My colleagues will put it on a link in the chat box for you to fill up the survey. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can take our survey by visiting apacdnsforum.my. If you haven't registered, please do, and we'll see you at the actual forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jerome. Thank you, Jerome. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much. Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks indeed. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.